They took his eyes, but they could never take his purpose. Imagine a man born into a world overshadowed by oppression, a nation enslaved not just by swords, but by fear and despair. Israel had lived under the rule of the Philistines for 40 long years, a time when hope seemed like a distant memory and survival was the only priority. Yet, in the midst of darkness, a spark of light was about to emerge, a man destined to change the course of history. Samson was born under a Nazarite vow, a sacred commitment that set him apart from birth. From the very beginning, his life was not ordinary. It was woven with purpose. No razor would ever touch his head. No wine or strong drink could pass his lips. And he must never come into contact with anything unclean. These were not just rules, they were symbols of a life fully dedicated to God. A life that would soon demonstrate that true strength comes not from muscle, but from devotion and faith. As a child, Samson was already marked by signs of divine favor. Small miracles, glimpses of extraordinary power, would hint at the destiny awaiting him. He was not meant to live as just another man. He was called to deliver Israel, to push back the darkness that had gripped his people for decades. But like all great stories, his journey would not be without struggle. Strength, no matter how immense, cannot shield a person from temptation, pride, or the consequences of their choices. From his earliest moments, Samson's life reflected the tension between human weakness and divine calling. A lion torn apart with bare hands, city gates lifted onto his shoulders, victories that seemed impossible, all these feats showcased his incredible gift. Yet, his heart often wrestled with desires that threatened to undermine his purpose. Desire, pride, and fleeting pleasures would test him again and again, proving that true power is not measured by what one can conquer, but by what one can surrender. This is a story about more than physical might. It is about the journey of a man who would lose everything, only to discover that strength and redemption come in unexpected forms. It is about understanding that even in failure, even in blindness and chains, there is hope. It is a story that asks, can someone rise from their lowest point, embrace their calling, and transform personal loss into the greatest victory? Samson's life answers with a resounding yes. As we dive into the epic tale of Samson, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss a single chapter of this incredible journey. Together, let us explore the rise, fall, and ultimate redemption of one of history's most legendary figures, a story that reminds us all that true strength is born not from power, but from surrender and faith. Even the greatest gifts can carry the weight of temptation, and Samson's life was a vivid testament to that truth. From the moment he began to realize the extraordinary strength that set him apart from every other man in Israel, there was a tension quietly threading through his days. A tension between the calling written into his life before he was even born and the impulses that stirred within his heart. Though he had been set apart as a Nazarite, consecrated to a divine purpose, the world around him was alive with allure, challenge, and danger. And Samson often found himself drawn toward the very things that threatened to undo him. As he grew, his encounters with the Philistines were not simply battles of strength, but reflections of the struggle inside him. The first glimpse of that inner battle came in Timnah, where he set his eyes upon a Philistine woman, a choice that would ripple through his life in ways no one could have anticipated. This desire was not rooted in love or devotion, but in impulse and attraction, and it illuminated a pattern that would recur throughout his journey. Moments of brilliance and triumph punctuated by the shadow of unchecked human yearning. When he insisted that his parents arrange the marriage despite their pleas, he revealed a subtle arrogance, a quiet confidence in his ability to shape the world according to his will, a confidence that often blinded him to the consequences of his choices. The story of the lion he tore apart with his bare hands and the honey he laid from its carcass illustrates this duality perfectly. On one hand, There was a clear, undeniable manifestation of divine power coursing through his veins, a gift meant to accomplish purposes far greater than any ordinary human could achieve. Yet on the other, there was the quiet disobedience, the choice to taste the honey in secret, to step just slightly beyond the boundaries of the sacred vow that defined him, to convince himself that such compromises were minor. This tension between devotion and desire, between calling and indulgence, was not external. It was woven into his very being, and it dictated much of the drama that followed. The wedding feast in Timnah became a stage upon which these conflicting forces played out. Samson's pride and sense of superiority led him to challenge the Philistines with a riddle born from the very incident that had already skirted the edges of his vow. He took delight in demonstrating intellectual dominance, not realizing that his secret, born of a lapse in judgment, had already sown the seeds of betrayal. When the Philistines coerced his bride into revealing the answer, the shock and fury that rose within him were not merely reactions to treachery. They were the consequence of a life where desire had quietly eroded restraint, and pride had overshadowed wisdom. In a flurry of anger, he struck down 30 men, took their belongings, and left his bride behind, an act of vengeance that carried immediate consequences and deepened the cycle of conflict, both with his enemies and with his own people. This pattern continued, reflecting a life in which the divine gift of strength was inseparable from the vulnerabilities of the heart. When his bride was given to another, the intensity of his reaction revealed how personal hurt and desire intertwined, driving him to extraordinary acts of destruction, tying foxes together to burn the Philistines' fields, creating chaos and loss in retribution. Yet even as he enacted justice, the consequences spiraled beyond his control, culminating in the death of the woman he had once sought. Samson's strength, awe-inspiring and unmatched, was inescapably tied to the choices his heart made, the impulses he indulged, and the pride he allowed to dictate his path. The conflict with his own people only intensified this internal struggle. When Judah sought to hand him over to the Philistines, Samson faced the bitter reality that even those he was meant to protect saw him not as a deliverer, but as a threat, a man whose decisions had complicated their survival. This betrayal forced him to confront not only external enemies, but also the consequences of his personal failings. His rage, his grief, and his awareness of isolation illuminated the complex intersection of divine calling and human frailty. Strength without discernment, power without humility, and gifts without guidance had brought him to a precarious place, where even miraculous feats could not shield him from the ramifications of choices made in pride and desire. Yet it was precisely within this tension between divine endowment and human weakness that Samson's story reveals its profound truth. His journey demonstrates that extraordinary ability is inseparable from responsibility and that spiritual gifts, however remarkable, cannot substitute for wisdom, self-control, or devotion. Every act of compromise, every moment in which he followed impulse over purpose, created ripples that touched allies and enemies alike. But it also set the stage for redemption, illustrating that awareness of one's weaknesses is not merely a path to failure, but an essential precursor to transformation. The battles Samson fought externally were mirrored by battles within, and the cost of indulgence, desire, and pride became inseparable from the eventual realization that true strength is found not in what one can do alone, but in what one can accomplish when aligned with a higher purpose. In tracing the trajectory of Samson's life through these early compromises and conflicts, it becomes clear that the man who could crush city gates and slay lions was simultaneously learning the hardest lessons of all: the consequences of unchecked desire, the fragility of pride, and the necessity of surrender. His struggles illuminate the delicate balance between power and responsibility, between the gifts we receive and the character required to wield them wisely, laying the foundation for the redemption that would ultimately define his legacy. Samson's life was a whirlwind of astonishing feats, moments of sheer, unthinkable strength that seemed almost mythic in their scale. Yet every act of power was inextricably entwined with consequence, teaching lessons he could not avoid. From the moment he encountered the lion in the wilderness, tearing it apart with nothing but his bare hands, it became clear that he was a man unlike any other, chosen not merely to survive but to deliver a people oppressed for decades. The act itself was extraordinary, a display of force beyond human comprehension. But it also marked the first in a series of choices that blurred the line between divine calling and personal desire. The honey he later took from the carcass was a small act, almost trivial in the eyes of an observer, yet it carried the weight of compromise, a subtle breach of his Nazarite vow, signaling the beginning of a path where extraordinary strength coexisted with flawed judgment and human frailty. In Samson, raw power and imperfect decision-making were perpetually intertwined, and his story would unfold as a testament to both the heights of human capability and the depths of vulnerability. As he matured, Samson's feats became increasingly dramatic, moving beyond single acts of physical prowess into demonstrations that shaped the political and social landscape of his time. The riddle he posed at his wedding feast, drawn from the incident with the lion, exemplified the duality of his character, blending cleverness with arrogance. And although the Philistines could not solve it on their own, the manipulation of those around him set the stage for betrayal and tragedy. When his bride's actions revealed the riddle to his enemies, Samson's fury erupted in a display of raw, overwhelming force. He struck down 30 men, claiming both victory and the spoils of their defeat. Yet the cost was immediate and deeply personal. The very act that demonstrated his strength also created devastation that rippled outward, affecting innocent lives and deepening his isolation, illustrating that the mightiest actions often carry consequences that even the strongest cannot fully control. This pattern became a recurring motif in Samson's life, extraordinary acts producing unintended outcomes, and each success shadowed by the consequences he could neither anticipate nor entirely prevent. The destruction Samson wrought upon the Philistine fields after discovering his wife had been given to another man serves as perhaps the most vivid illustration of this tension. In a single, audacious act, he captured 300 foxes, tied them in pairs with burning torches, and set the fields ablaze, annihilating vineyards, wheat, and olive groves. The fire consumed the symbols of prosperity and peace, devastating livelihoods and ensuring the Philistines would never forget the power Samson wielded. Yet even this brilliant display of resourcefulness and strength was double-edged. While it exacted vengeance on those who had wronged him, it also resulted in the death of his bride, an innocent caught in the crossfire of pride, anger, and untempered impulse. His actions, though spectacular, were far from clean victories. They were reminders that extraordinary gifts, if exercised without wisdom, can bring suffering as well as triumph, and that the line between heroism and destruction is often perilously thin. Samson's confrontations with his own people further reveal the complex consequences of his power. When the men of Judah attempted to hand him over to the Philistines, it became painfully evident that even those he was destined to protect viewed him through the lens of fear and survival rather than faith and admiration. Bound and led like a criminal to face an overwhelming enemy, Samson's moment of despair did not negate his strength, but instead reframed it, highlighting that true power is not merely the ability to act, but also the discernment to act rightly within the consequences of one's environment. Seizing the jawbone of a donkey, a seemingly insignificant object, he struck down 1,000 Philistines, a feat that demonstrated that God could transform the simplest tools into instruments of remarkable victory. Yet even in triumph, there remained the unavoidable truth that each display of supernatural might had come at a price, whether in the form of grief, isolation, or the lives of those caught inadvertently in the wake of his actions. The episode in Gaza further amplifies this lesson, illustrating how Samson's physical strength, while unmatched, could not shield him from the vulnerabilities of human desire, carrying the massive city gates on his shoulders, moving them as if they were nothing more than branches. He showcased a power that defied imagination, a feat that would be sung for generations as a symbol of invincibility. But this act, like many others, occurred alongside choices driven by impulsive desire, moments where his human inclinations exposed him to manipulation and eventual downfall. Each city he struck, each enemy he vanquished, was mirrored by internal battles he could not always win: the relentless pull of pride, the seduction of temptation, and the subtle erosion of his spiritual focus. His strength, though awe-inspiring, was never isolated from consequence. Every remarkable act created ripples that extended far beyond the immediate victory, shaping his fate and the destiny of those around him. Through Samson's extraordinary feats, a central truth emerges: strength in isolation is incomplete, and power divorced from discernment is vulnerable to tragedy. The lion, the burning fields, the captured gates, and the slain Philistines were not merely stories of might. They were lessons in the intertwined nature of human ability and accountability. His life demonstrates that even the greatest strengths, if exercised without mindfulness and humility, can yield outcomes that are both magnificent and devastating, teaching that the measure of true heroism lies not only in what one can accomplish, but also in the wisdom to temper action with responsibility. In Samson, the world witnesses both the splendor of supernatural power and the intricate web of unintended consequences that power inevitably generates, a story that continues to resonate as a reflection on the balance between gift, choice, and the unfolding of destiny. Even the strongest among us are never immune to the quiet, insidious power of manipulation, and for Samson, that power arrived in the form of Delilah, a woman whose presence would test not only his physical might, but the very foundation of his judgment and self-control. From the moment they met, there was an allure he could not resist, an attraction that felt like destiny yet carried the hidden weight of peril. And though he had witnessed the consequences of unchecked desire before, the pull toward Delilah was irresistible, a siren call that spoke to loneliness, curiosity, and the human yearning for intimacy. The Philistine rulers, ever watchful and cunning, recognized this vulnerability, and they presented her with a staggering offer: silver sufficient to secure her future if she could uncover the secret of Samson's unparalleled strength, a fortune that transformed her desire for wealth into a weapon against him. And in her careful, patient seduction, Samson was drawn deeper into a trap he could not yet see. Deba. Her questions, her subtle accusations, her whispered pleas became an assault upon his resolve, eroding the careful boundaries he had maintained between desire and duty. And each lie he told to mislead her was a temporary shield, a fragile veneer over the truth that gnawed quietly at the edges of his conscience. He teased her with instructions to bind him in ways that were impossible, each time escaping effortlessly. Yet even as he broke free, the cracks in his focus widened, revealing that supernatural strength could not fortify a heart swayed by flattery and persistence. Delilah's strategy was patient, relentless, and precise, exploiting the rhythm of his human weakness. For she understood that true power over a man like Samson lay not in confrontation, but in the slow, unrelenting pressure of persuasion. Every morning and every evening, she would press him, whispering promises and threats, feigning vulnerability and love, until the weight of her insistence became unbearable. And in the quiet desperation of repeated questioning, Samson's defenses began to crumble. It was not a sudden betrayal but a gradual surrender, a moment of human exhaustion where pride faltered and the need for approval, affection, and the end of nagging became stronger than the memory of his consecration, stronger than the awareness of his covenant with God. And in that private, intimate collapse. He revealed the secret that had defined him since birth. The Nazarite vow, the sacred pledge that consecrated his life and allowed the Spirit of the Lord to rest upon him. The vow that prohibited cutting his hair, touching the dead, and partaking of wine. Delilah, who had feigned loyalty and desire, seized this revelation not with brute force but with quiet precision. And while Samson slept upon her lap, trusting in her affection, she summoned those who had promised silver for his downfall, and allowed the shears to cut the 7 braids of his hair. In that single act, the covenant that had empowered him was severed. Not merely the strands of hair, but the tangible connection between his divine calling and the manifestation of strength that had marked every extraordinary feat of his life. When he awoke, the familiar surge of power that had carried him through impossible battles was gone, and for the first time, Samson felt the vulnerability that accompanies the loss of divine favor, a stark reminder that human strength alone cannot prevail against the careful orchestration of deceit. Captured by the Philistines, blinded and bound with bronze shackles, he was taken to Gaza, the very city whose gates he had carried upon his shoulders, a living testament to how reversal and misfortune can turn triumph into humiliation. Grinding grain in the prison, forced to perform the monotonous labor of servitude, he became a spectacle for those who had once feared him. His blindness not simply a physical limitation, but a profound symbol of spiritual disorientation, punishment that extended beyond flesh to soul, echoing the lesson that power, when divorced from prudence, can be both fleeting and treacherous. Each day was a repetition of degradation, each rotation of the mill a measure of his fall, and the laughter, mockery, and scorn of the Philistines filled the space where freedom and purpose had once resided. Yet even in this darkness, the narrative of Samson's life did not end, for in the quiet confines of suffering, awareness began to stir, a recognition that the loss of strength was not the end of his story, but a profound opportunity to learn, reflect, and redirect the forces within his heart toward the one source of power that could restore him. In those hours of solitude and forced labor, the lessons of his previous actions, pride, desire, impulsive vengeance, and untempered strength were crystallized in a form too vivid to ignore. He had faced enemies with unmatched power, yet it had been human weakness, not swords or city walls, that had brought him to the depths of imprisonment and despair. The betrayal by Delilah was both a personal and symbolic turning point, a demonstration that even the greatest gifts can be compromised when vigilance fails, and that the subtleties of manipulation often wield more destructive force than armies or weapons. The Philistines, reveling in what they assumed to be their ultimate victory, failed to perceive that in every moment of weakness and humiliation, Samson's mind and spirit were recalibrating. That chains, blindness, and the monotony of labor were sculpting a humility and dependence that had been absent in his earlier life, and that the final chapter of his strength would arise not from rebellion or brute force alone, but from a deeper surrender to the source of all true power. Even as he stumbled through the public spaces of captivity, guided by those who had enslaved him, each step became a meditation on failure and potential redemption. And though he could not see, he began to perceive the truths that had eluded him in moments of triumph. That strength without discipline is fragile, that independence without obedience is perilous, and that the most transformative victories often come through endurance, reflection, and the quiet work of surrender. His chains, both physical and symbolic, were reminders of the consequences of desire and the cost of compromised judgment. Yet they were also the instruments through which a renewed understanding of purpose would emerge, a realization that ultimate strength is inseparable from reliance upon a higher guiding power, and that even in the lowest moments, opportunity for restoration and redemption remains. The capture and blinding of Samson stand as a dramatic pivot in the narrative, a moment where divine strength seemed withdrawn, human frailty exposed, and yet the seeds of ultimate victory were being planted in the soil of loss and reflection. His story, marked by acts of phenomenal power, lapses in judgment, and the crushing weight of betrayal, continues to illuminate the delicate interplay between extraordinary gifts and human vulnerability, showing that even the mightiest can fall, and that the path to true redemption often wins through humility, obedience, and the willingness to be restored from the very depths of defeat. The days of captivity, marked by the grinding monotony of prison labor and the relentless humiliation of public display, became the crucible in which Samson's spirit, long neglected and battered by the consequences of his own impulsiveness, began to awaken to the subtle but transformative power of true surrender. And in the dim confines of the Philistine prison, stripped of sight and subjected to the scorn of those he had once struck down with ease, he discovered that strength uninsured to purpose and humility was a fragile force, fleeting and prone to betrayal. Yet within this very weakness lay the seed of profound restoration, for it was here, amid chains and shadows, that Samson turned inward, seeking a connection far deeper than muscle and rage, a communion with the God who had consecrated his life from birth, and whose presence had been the source of every extraordinary feat he had ever accomplished. In those silent hours, as he leaned upon the rough stone walls and felt the weight of bronze shackles biting into his flesh, Samson prayed not with the confidence of his past victories, but with the humility of a man who had tasted both power and its loss, and with each whispered appeal, each private acknowledgement of failure, a quiet transformation took root, teaching him that the essence of strength is not measured in feats of physical might but in the steadfastness of the spirit, and the willingness to submit to a power greater than oneself, a lesson forged not in triumph but in the shadows of adversity, as the years of servitude stretched onward. The Philistines, oblivious to the subtle reclamation of his inner strength, reveled in their perceived victory, parading him before crowds and flaunting his blindness as a testament to their dominance. Yet in every taunt, every mockery, Samson absorbed the lessons of patience and reflection, and through the relentless repetition of labor, he cultivated an awareness of the intricate balance between divine gift and human responsibility, understanding that the hair on his head had never been the source of power itself, but the outward sign of a covenant that required devotion, obedience, and alignment with God's will, a realization that transformed each strand severed by Delilah's hands from a symbol of shame into a reminder of the sacred source from which true strength flowed. Each day became a meditation, each swing of the millstone a testament to endurance, and within this crucible of suffering, Samson's spirit began to mend, his reliance shifting from the fleeting confidence of self-reliance to the enduring assurance found in surrender to the divine, a trust that promised restoration not through human cunning but through faith and obedience, a radical inversion of the principles that had guided his earlier exploits, now steeped in reflection, repentance, and an understanding of the consequences of pride. The final scene of Samson's life unfolded in a moment of both extraordinary physical exertion and profound spiritual significance, when the Philistine leaders, gathered in the grand temple of Dagon to celebrate a victory they believed absolute, summoned him to entertain their reverie, a spectacle of human cruelty and hubris. Yet within this public theater, Samson's awareness of his covenant and dependence upon God crystallized, and he positioned himself between the central pillars of the temple, feeling not merely the raw wood and stone beneath his hands, but the tangible presence of divine power that had quietly returned to him, a reminder that strength, when aligned with purpose and faith, transcends human limitation. The crowd, oblivious to the transformation occurring in their captive, jeered and mocked, their laughter a sharp contrast to the solemn resolve now burning within him, and in a single, decisive act, Samson called upon the God who had been with him since birth, and the temple trembled under the force of his final prayer. A structure once meant to exalt human pride crumbling under the manifestation of divine might. The collapse a dramatic testament to the principle he had learned in chains, that true power resides not in domination, in brute force, or in personal glory, but in the complete surrender to and dependence upon the divine, a power that, when invoked with faith, transforms vulnerability into victory, weakness into strength, and finality into redemption. In that climactic moment, as pillars toppled and the cries of the Philistines filled the air, Samson's death became simultaneously an act of deliverance and of judgment, a culmination of a life marked by extraordinary feats, human error, and ultimate reconciliation with the source of his true power, illustrating that the journey to strength is neither linear nor free from suffering, but is in fact a path shaped by temptation, failure, reflection, and the patient cultivation of dependence upon a higher power. A lesson etched not only in the story of a man renowned for his might, but in the broader human understanding that greatness cannot exist without humility, and that redemption, often found at the nadir of despair, carries a potency far exceeding any triumph born solely of self-will. Even in death, the resonance of Samson's final act echoed beyond the ruins of the temple, leaving a legacy of awe, caution, and inspiration, a narrative that intertwines human frailty with divine intervention, and demonstrates that the fullest expression of strength emerges not through prideful assertion, but through recognition, surrender, and trust in the sustaining power of God. A timeless reminder that the extraordinary is often inseparable from the humble acknowledgement of one's dependence upon forces beyond the self. Samson's life, from miraculous birth to final redemptive act, illustrates the enduring truth that human might, no matter how formidable, is only fully realized when guided by faith and tempered by obedience, and that the journey from weakness to power, from failure to restoration, is a process in which surrender to divine will transforms vulnerability into the ultimate expression of strength, leaving a legacy that continues to captivate, instruct, and inspire those who reflect upon the delicate balance between extraordinary gifts, human imperfection, and the transcendent source from which all true power flows. As we reflect on the life of Samson, it becomes clear that his story is far more than a series of extraordinary feats and dramatic confrontations. It is a timeless narrative that speaks to the human experience of temptation, pride, and the pursuit of purpose, showing us that even the strongest among us are vulnerable to the allure of desire and the pitfalls of arrogance. From his miraculous birth, set apart under the Nazarite vow, to the awe-inspiring strength that allowed him to defeat lions and topple entire cities, Samson's life was marked by extraordinary gifts. Yet these gifts alone were insufficient to guide him through the complexities of human weakness. His repeated entanglements with temptation, particularly through his relationship with Delilah, reveal the persistent danger of allowing personal desires to overshadow higher calling and responsibility. Each misstep, each moment of impulsive decision-making, carried consequences not only for him but for those around him, demonstrating that strength without wisdom, without humility, is vulnerable to exploitation and collapse. Yet, within these trials, there lies a profound lesson about the potential for redemption. Even when Samson's power seemed entirely lost, when he was blind, shackled, and humiliated in the hands of the Philistines, the spark of divine purpose remained alive within him. His eventual return to strength, not through human cunning or force, but through sincere reliance on God, teaches that true power is inseparable from surrender and faith. It is a reminder that our weaknesses are not the end of our story. They are opportunities for transformation, a space where character, faith, and resilience can be forged. In the final act of his life, when Samson brings down the pillars of the Philistine temple, He does not merely exact revenge. He fulfills a purpose that transcends personal gain, turning what could have been total ruin into a moment of triumph that serves a greater good, demonstrating the incredible potential for turning adversity into meaningful action. Samson's narrative, therefore, is both cautionary and hopeful. It warns us of the dangers inherent in unchecked pride, in seeking fulfillment solely through personal gratification, and in underestimating the responsibilities that come with extraordinary gifts. At the same time, it offers hope that redemption is always possible, that failure is not final, and that even the most profound weaknesses can be transformed into sources of strength and inspiration when aligned with purpose and guided by faith. The human heart, like Samson's, is capable of both great error and remarkable recovery. The measure of a life is not solely the moments of triumph, but the capacity to rise after falling, to seek connection with a higher calling, and to embrace the lessons embedded in suffering. For all of us, Samson's story serves as a mirror reflecting the complexities of ambition, desire, and moral responsibility. It challenges us to consider how we wield our own strengths, how we respond to temptation, and how we seek redemption when we falter. His life invites a reflection on the balance between human agency and divine guidance, reminding us that the truest forms of achievement are rooted not in dominance over others, but in alignment with values, integrity, and purpose beyond self-interest. The final moments of Samson, standing firm as the temple collapses around him, illustrate that the culmination of a life well directed, even after repeated missteps, is a profound testament to resilience, faith, and the transformative potential of surrendering to a higher power. As we close this story, may it inspire you to examine the ways in which you navigate your own strengths and weaknesses, to recognize the power of humility and faith, and to remember that failure is not a permanent state, but a stepping stone to growth, purpose, and redemption. Samson's life, though ancient, carries lessons that remain vividly relevant today, showing that no matter how great our errors, the opportunity to rise, to reclaim our purpose, and to transform our weaknesses into sources of strength is always within reach. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the extraordinary life of Samson. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking this video, subscribing to our channel, and sharing it with others who might find inspiration in these timeless lessons of strength, failure, and redemption.